Hey, welcome, Modern Math Teacher. Kristen Moore here, your host on the Modern Math Teacher podcast. And today I'm going to go and ask you the question that is real divisive. Are your grading practices making the grade? Now, listen, when we talk grading, that is a real taboo and touchy subject for so many teachers. It's one thing that everyone holds near and dear to their heart. Everyone has their own firm beliefs that their grading practices are what's best for students, are going to ensure their learning. And I'm not here to tell you that they're not. I'm here to ask you, though, are your grading practices equitable? Are they fair? Are they a true representation of understanding? So, in today's tough topic, as our Poolside PD, we're unpacking equitable grading practices with some ideas on different ways that you could make sure that your grading practices are equitable and fair for your students. And we're also going to talk about the notion of ungrading. Promise this is going to be bite sized. We're going to keep it light just to give you a couple of ideas on ways you might want to tweak your grading practices before moving into fall. All right. So, first up, let's talk about what does it mean to be equitable when it comes to grading practices. So, equitable grading ensures that grades accurately reflect a student's understanding. They are free from bias and they motivate them to achieve success, motivate students to achieve success. Throughout this episode, I'll be referencing Joe Feldman's Grading for Equity, a must read if you have not yet. And we'll also explore some grading practices that you can implement to make sure that you are grading accurately, you're bias resistant, and that your grades are motivational. And those are the key pillars of equitable grading. So, what do those things mean? Let's talk first about accuracy. When you are grading, I think we all can agree that our grades should be accurate. They should be mathematically sound, easy to understand, and they should correctly describe a student's level of understanding, not just how compliant they are. So here's my pushback for you. Some of the grading practices that you might want to include are avoiding the zeros. Get the zero out of your gradebook. You might want to use a minimum grade, like a 50% as the lowest grade instead. You could also consider switching to the 0 to 4 scale, weighting more recent performance, or something along those lines. And importantly, especially if you're doing collaborative work or group thinking, you want to make sure that you're grading your individual and not the group. Those are different things you can think about when you're thinking about accuracy. For ensuring your grades are bias resistant, this is where we want to make sure that our grades are based on evidence of students' knowledge, not external factors or our implicit bias or things beyond our control. So, this includes making sure you are not giving extra credit. I know that's a tough one. Students always ask for it, but extra credit waters down your grade. So, no extra credit. Your grading should also not be based on the timing of work. Yes, we want our students to turn in work on time, but lateness penalties are introducing a bias to the grade. And you want to include some non-grade consequences for cheating. So instead of just giving them a 0 on something, you want to make sure you've got an idea on how you can still accurately assess them without giving them that 0, kind of going back to that first one. And again, you want to exclude participation. I know, again, another tough one. A lot of us want to give our students grades to bolster their grade, really, based on them participating, or we want to punish them for lack of participation. Both of those bias inducing. So things that we want to eliminate. I've also seen teachers grade solely based on summative assessments. So there's some pros and cons there, but we'll talk more. The other key pillar is that your grade should be motivational. So they should motivate your students to achieve success. We don't want them to feel defeated by a grade. We want them to feel inspired. It's going to support that growth mindset. So again, using that 0 to 4 practice, that's also mathematically accurate. Win-win. It's in 2 categories. That's a great way to do it. Also thinking about switching to standards-based grading and incorporating self-assessment and using student trackers. A lot of those are intertwined, and we'll deep dive into standards-based grading next week, actually. But also the idea of allowing retakes and redos. That is something that I hold fast to in my classroom. You have to be able to retake an assessment if you've learned the material better. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some strategies or the practicality of those different practices. So, focusing again on the accurate grading, avoiding a 0. A 0 will just mathematically tank your score. There's no way around it. Especially, it doesn't even matter if you're doing category-based weighting percentages, where it's 80% summative and 20% formative, or if you do points-based, that 0 is going to improportionately tank your score for no reason. You may want to consider instead using that minimum grading. And again, they say 50% is helpful, right? So using a minimum of 50% on that grading scale to prevent a single 0 from disproportionately affecting a student's grade. It still communicates the quote unquote failure. If you're thinking about percentages from 0 to 100, 50% is failing just as much as 0% is failing, but it has less of an impact on the overall grade book. So something to consider with that. Instead of a 0, replace it with a 50. One way you could have more accurate grades. Another way you could have more accurate grades this fall is switching to the 0 to 4 mastery-based scale. Whether you're doing that with competency-based learning or standards-based grading, or you're just kind of switching to mastery and feeling your way around with that, that's going to simplify your grading and make it easier to understand. It's the level of understanding that your student has. So the 0 to 4 scale, something I often use in my classroom. I've been using, 13, 14 years. Ooh, it's been a while. Really helps students identify like where they're at, where they're going. And so again, that leads into that motivational category below. Okay. You also want to consider, if you don't like either of those, weighting the most recent performance. Okay. This is going to reflect your students' current understanding rather than their early struggles. This can be tied similarly to like the summative being more of a percentage or being the only thing taken into account, because in the early days of an assignment and practice, they're likely to get it wrong. They're going to make some errors. So you might want to weight the more recent performance, depending on what you are grading in your classroom. All right. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you are grading each individual and not a group as a whole, not just assigning one big group grade, because we want a student's grade to be a reflection of their individual knowledge, not some of their individual knowledge, plus some of their collective knowledge, plus their participation, plus their ability to turn in things on time. Like it gets all muddy then, right? So no need for that. So again, accurate grading, avoid the zeros, consider minimum grading, 0 to 4 scale, weighting recent performance, and ensuring that you are doing individual, not group grades. Okay, let's talk some strategies and tips for the biased resistant practices. Y'all, we got to get over this. There's no extra credit. Ask your parents for tissues, supplies, whatever you need. You don't need to lure students in with it with extra credit. Extra credit, it overinflates your grades for non-academic factors. So just plain and simple, it's not worth it. Your grades no longer mean the same thing. Okay. Also consider excluding participation, right? Again, that is a non-academic factor. Yes, we want our students to participate, but sometimes it's just not possible, or they could be having a bad day, or so many things. So grades should reflect knowledge, not behavior or participation. So it's why we're not giving extra credit. That's why we are not including participation. You also want to consider here, non-grade consequences for cheating. Again, cheating is a behavior. And so giving them that 0 just because they cheated, that waters down their grade disproportionately. Again, going back to the accuracy. So we want to maintain the integrity of our grades and come up with a non-grade consequence for cheating. Perhaps that means that they now have to take the test again in a more secure environment. Maybe they have to sit next to you when they take it. Maybe their phones are put away. I don't know. So many ideas. If you have an idea for a non-grade consequence to cheating, make sure you share that with me at More Than Just X. Okay. So those were our biased resistant practices. Now, some motivational practices that we should be using or could be using in our classrooms. Again, utilizing rubrics and scales. If you're considering the 0 to 4 shift that we've mentioned in a couple of the other practices, you want to make sure that you have clear criteria to help your students understand expectations and how to improve from that 0 to the 1 to the 2 to the 3 to the 4, right? You could consider standards-based grading. This is going to focus on the mastery of specific skills and knowledge, and that is a whole beast in and of itself. I love standards-based grading. I love mastery-based grading. We're going to dive into that in depth next week. So if that's something that's piquing your interest right now, make sure you click follow or subscribe so that you can make sure that we catch that episode next week. Okay. We also want to think about using some autonomy for our students. So giving them self-assessment and some student trackers. Let them figure out where they're at in their learning, what they could do better, how they can improve. You're going to empower your students to take ownership of their learning that way. And if you do nothing else out of any of these practices, I really, really hope that you allow retakes and redos. This is going to encourage a growth mindset and continuous improvement. I don't often have students who just take the test, decide to, bomb it, fail it on purpose just because they know they can redo it. Oftentimes in my classroom and in your classroom, if you're going to do this, you want to have a policy set in place for what they need to do to qualify for that retake or that redo of an assignment. And that could be anything from meeting with you one on one, going back through their homework, rewatching their notes, attending after school tutoring, any sort of thing. But allowing retakes and redos so that your students can show that they have gained that knowledge, they have improved upon it. Super motivational for your students. And the ultimate goal is that your students are learning, right? So let's let them learn and let's let them demonstrate what they learned. Okay. So those are some equitable grading practices you could consider for this upcoming school year. But what about the idea that maybe we just don't grade? That's called ungrading. So, ungrading involves removing those traditional grades entirely and focusing instead on feedback and continuous improvement. You might want to consider ungrading because it encourages that intrinsic motivation and a deeper learning. It really can reduce the stress and competition amongst students. So, for highly anxious students, that can be super helpful. And it promotes that growth mindset again by focusing on feedback and improvement. If you're thinking about implementing some ungrading practices or an ungrading classroom, there's a fantastic book that you can read. It chronicles like 15 different teachers. I'll make sure I link that in the show notes. But some tips for that are to ensure that you are providing regular, detailed feedback instead of grades. That's the part that's a little bit time consuming. You've got to make sure that you are giving students feedback on what's working, what's not, how they can improve. You also, again, want to encourage some student self assessment so they can assess their own work and set goals for improvement and reflect on their learning. So, incorporating reflective practices like journals and portfolios can help the students to capture what's going on in their mind and in their learning process. And that gives you a tool to have for conferences. You want to regularly hold one on one conferences with your students to discuss their progress and some areas for growth. Okay. So, I told you I'm trying to make this one a quick one. I know it's a divisive topic. Again, today, if you are interested in overhauling some or all of your grading practices, consider reading Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. Fantastic book, outlines those three key pillars: accurate, bias resistant, and motivational. All sorts of strategies in there, from the no zero policy to the 0 to 4 grading scale, standards based grading. All sorts of really interesting and great practices are in there. You can pick one or two or try a whole suite of them. That would be cool. Or if you're interested in the idea of providing feedback and continuous growth in your classroom, consider Ungrading, Why Rating Students Undermines Their Learning and What to Do Instead. And that was edited by Susan Blum. I'll make sure both of them in the show notes here. Again, if you've read one or you are reading one, make sure you share your thoughts on it with all of us here in the Modern Math Teachers community by sharing it in our Facebook group, the Modern Math Teachers Movement, over on Facebook. All right, you guys, this is going to wrap us up for today. We talked real taboo. Grading practices are something we all hold near and dear to our heart. And I know that you're an amazing teacher and that whatever grading practices and policies you have in your classroom are coming from a great place. I hope that this episode gave you something to think about on one shift you could make to make your grading practices a little bit more equitable for the upcoming school year. Whether that's focusing on your accuracy, some bias resistance, motivation, or going gradeless and ungrading and focusing on that feedback and growth. Implementing these practices can create a fairer and more effective grading system that supports you and your students. All right, that's the sun out there. I'm going to end it here. Head on out to the pool. Until next time, you guys, keep thinking about those practices. Keep refining your practice. As always, keep it real. Bye, guys.